Good morning, everyone. I hope this video finds you well and that you're enjoying your e-learning assignments and your time away from our school building. It's currently Monday, so I'm recording this ahead of time, but I'm recording Wednesday's lecture. I just wanted to start off with plan books so you guys knew what you were kind of looking at for the week, and then also next week. So Monday or Tuesday, you're going to be doing vocab. Again, that digital vocab, you're some typing definitions. Please don't copy and paste. It doesn't take that much effort to type them out. And then you are going to actually copy and paste this part. You're going to find Google Images, paste them into the vocab assignment, and call it done. So that actually should be quicker for you than traditional vocab to kind of start off this unit. So this is our fourth unit. Our fourth unit deals with macroeconomics. It's a perfect time to be talking macroeconomics because of the actions of the Federal Reserve and the actions of the global economy right now. So I'm excited that we get to apply some real life lessons to class. So I'll be talking about macroeconomics today. That's your Wednesday lecture. And then hopefully you saw the video on Edpuzzle and you were able to get into Edpuzzle and create an account and stuff. If you're having issues with that, please let me know. But you are going to be watching this through Edpuzzle, so hopefully at this point you're there. I will have questions throughout this, not too many, but those questions are going to be embedded in this video. So that's actually your Thursday assignment, is those questions. Okay, and then Friday you guys have an article to read, and then you'll have some questions to answer next week. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at next week. Again, you have some form of Google form to answer questions and reading on Friday. You'll have another lecture for next Wednesday, and then Edpuzzle questions over that as well. Okay, so we are moving right along. We'll be dealing with population soon as well. If this goes any longer, then we'll be looking at some videos and stuff. So plenty of things to be working with. I do want to go ahead and get into our lecture for today. And because we don't have to wait on people to write, we probably won't have too many questions since you guys can ask questions right now. This shouldn't take too long. Okay, so I'm going to go through these. I'm hoping 20 minutes, and you always can hit those speed up buttons so that you can speed through these a little bit quicker. Okay, so again, we're talking macroeconomics. I enjoy talking about macroeconomics because we start to see the big global picture come together. So central questions today. First one is, why is the GDP such a good indicator and measurement for the economy? Second question, why must GDP be adjusted for inflation? And then third question, what are the limitations for using the GDP? Okay, so GDP we talked about way back at the beginning of the year, beginning of the semester, and we're still going to talk about it here. It's very important. It's a huge indicator for how the economy is doing because it is the total sum value of all goods produced in a country in a year. Okay, this is basically what a country's worth, what a country's making over the course of a year. So I do enjoy looking at this. I like to dispel some common myths. Now, there are different types of GDP. So for the most part, we're talking purchasing power parity, which is called the PPP. GDP, PPP is depicted here. Okay. So these numbers are going to change depending on what you're looking at. Again, I pulled this data from Wikipedia because it's really good at providing nice tables for us to look at. So this is according to the International Monetary Fund. A different group might have these numbers a little bit different, and then there's different types of GDP. So if you're looking at a different type of GDP, these numbers are going to change as well. Okay. So common myth that I see a lot of time is that people are always talking about China's economy and how big it is and how it's overtaking the United States. Well, it's getting there, and it is increasing quickly. But right now, the U.S. still has the largest economy in the world. Okay, our economy, our GDP is $21 trillion a year. Now, when you go back and you look at that debt, when we did our U.S. debt project, that has our debt at $23 trillion a year. Do you see how, while we should be worried about the national debt, it's not the end of the world yet because our GDP is so high? Now, we were one of these countries, like Canada, and we had a $23 trillion debt, that's probably a much bigger issue because then their debt size is 20 times the size of their GDP. Okay, so this is really the most common indicator that we look at to see how the economy is doing. So we look at the GDP, and if it's increasing or decreasing, we can say the economy is growing or the economy is declining. And this can also be an indicator for a recession. Okay, so again, great time to be talking about this stuff because of what's happening around the world. Okay, again, the U.S. GDP is 18.5 trillion, or sorry, it was. I haven't updated this, so it's at 21.3 trillion. And this is all about macroeconomics. Macroeconomics are large-scale decisions and large-scale actions of big economies. So economies of countries, economies of the world. Okay, that's what we're talking about for this unit. I always enjoy looking at this map here. This map is a cartogram, so what it does is it greatly exaggerates accuracy of features to portray data. So this data is economy size, so you can see great exaggerations with the United States, Europe, especially Western Europe's very large. China's gigantic, which it normally is, but then the fun one to look at is this is Japan. Japan's an itty bitty tiny country, and on this diagram, it's gigantic. Okay, so interesting to look at. Okay, so our GDP is calculated by all goods and services produced in the U.S., but there's some exceptions here. This is any intermediate product which is used to make other things. For example, car tires. A lot of the car tires that we produce go onto brand new cars. Those are not included in the GDP. However, if we have a car tire that's bought as a replacement tire, it is included in the GDP. So this is a complicated number to figure out. I put baked goods here because they're the same thing. If you buy salt, flour, baking powder, you make some cookies, then it's not actually, those items aren't included in the GDP, but the final product, when you sell the cookies, those are. Okay. Secondhand sales, used goods are already counted in the GDP once. They don't get counted again. So if you have a car and then you go to sell that car, it doesn't get registered as part of the GDP. But when it rolls off the factory line, the assembly line to begin with, it is included. Non-market transactions, so if you do things that normally have a value, but you're doing them for yourself, those don't count as well. So let's say you're a plumber, you spring a leak in your own house, you go and you fix that leak. That action, fixing that leak, doesn't actually add to the GDP. Okay. Same thing for like mowing your yard. If you mow yards for a living, you run some type of landscaping company, and you do that stuff for yourself, then it does not count towards GDP. And then, of course, the underground economy that seems kind of shady and dark and illegal. However, there is plenty of things that happen on the underground economy that are perfectly legal. Anytime that you make some money and you don't report it for taxes, that's technically part of the underground economy. So if you babysit and you don't report and pay taxes on that babysitting money, that's underground economy. That's earned income, but it's not reported as taxable. Okay, so there's legal and illegal here. Obviously, selling drugs or anything like that is going to also factor in there. None of that stuff's counted for the GDP. Okay, moving on here, real GDP. Real GDP is a difficult number to find because there are some problems with the main GDP. When we look at GDP, purchasing power parity, it's difficult to kind of see what's going on there, and it's difficult to break things down. That's a big number that most people can't really grasp. So with the GDP, if inflation continues and inflation increases, then the GDP is going to naturally rise over time. Even if we don't change production from one year to the next, if inflation goes up by, say, 5%, then you are going to see that change in GDP. So we want to make sure that we're accounting for that and that we're not being tricked into thinking the economy is growing when in fact it's just inflation that's growing. Okay. Some countries are going to have a larger population and therefore they're going to produce more and they're going to have a higher GDP. This is China. China has 1 billion people. So for 1 billion people to hit 14 billion in the GDP, that doesn't take a ton of effort. However, the US has 300 million people. So for us to hit that high of a number, $21 billion or $1 trillion, that's not as difficult for us to do. Okay. So population definitely can skew these numbers. So to address those two problems, the first problem, we adjust for inflation. So what that means is we come up with a number called real GDP, and we take the GDP and we measure it in, say, the year 2000's dollars. We adjust it by subtracting the inflation rate. Okay, this gives us a more correct number and allows us to determine if the economy is growing or if the economy is slowing down. Okay, GDP is definitely measured per person sometimes. This is what this chart over here is showing us. So when we take the population of all these countries and then we divide it by their GDP, this gives us a better number as far as how rich people are individually within those countries. So this is called GDP per capita meaning per person. Okay. In my opinion, this gives us our most accurate number because it's comparing populations comparing countries without population as a factor. So Qatar is going to have the strongest economy when it comes to pure wealth based on its size. Okay. Now, Qatar, no one thinks of Qatar as a wealthy country because while they are wealthy per capita, they really don't make that much money in the grand scheme of things. Hopefully that makes sense. If you don't get it, please let me know. So notice the difference between this and that first chart. The US was ranked way up here, number 1. We're all the way down to number 10 now. And you don't even see China on this list. China drops all the way down into the 70s on this list. Because again, they have such a big population. One other factor here, most of these countries tend to be tiny, and that works in their favor. A small country can produce more per person, but isn't going to produce more overall. So it's going to kind of favor those small countries rather than bigger countries. Okay, limitations and uses. First of all, the GDP doesn't show us what's being produced, just the value, and this can cause problems. So when we were looking during the Cold War, and the US and Russia were racing at everything. We were racing to the moon. We were racing to build the biggest and strongest nukes. We were racing to build the strongest military. We were racing economically, and we were comparing our economies at that time. The US was producing lots of things for people, like domestic products and goods for its citizens. The Soviet Union was producing a lot of military weapons. Okay, those have two very different actual impacts on people. If people are starving but you're building tanks, that your economy is probably not doing very well, even though the GDP will reflect that it is. Okay, so that is one limitation to the GDP. It doesn't tell us what's being produced. So for example, in China right now, they are producing a lot of cheap consumer goods for Europe, for North America, for the United States, and they might not be taking care of their people. Okay, so that's kind of the limitation there. Now, some of the things that are produced can give you very little satisfaction or utility, and that's just one of the limitations of the GDP. Okay, the main use now of the GDP, though, is to show us how fast the economy is growing or shrinking. Okay, so you can see in this chart here, we can clearly see main world events because of what the economy and the GDP is doing. So we have the Great Depression, you see that big dip. You then see World War II, where we have this huge explosion of growth. And then we have the 1950s, and we have the Vietnam War. So you see all these increases, small recessions here and there, kind of sporadically. And then you have this big drop again, 2008, 2009, with the energy crisis and the housing bubble that both happened. Now, more GDP equals more transactions equals good economic health. So we want to make sure that that GDP is consistently going up and increasing with minor corrections along the way. Okay, so right here from right after post-World War II all the way up to 2009, that's what you like to see because the economy is correcting occasionally, but mostly it's increasing. That's a lot of growth. That indicates a very healthy economy. Okay, so there are other measurements that we can use to determine economic growth. One of those is GNP. This is the value of all goods and services produced with labor, with property owned by citizens of a country. Okay, this is different. GNP is companies owned by U.S. citizens. So I think this diagram does the best job possible at explaining this. So for example, Ford is an American company. Whatever Ford produces worldwide, even in Britain over here, or in the United States, it contributes to our GNP. Okay. UK, British Petroleum, BP, that's a British company. So whatever it produces is going to go to the UK's GNP. However, BP in the United States and Ford in the United States is going to contribute to our GDP. Okay, this shows how productive companies in countries are worldwide. Okay, so when jobs leave and they go to China or Mexico or Japan or other places in Asia, then they are going to still contribute to our GNP. So this is a number that we could still see how successful those companies are while ignoring some of our GDP. Okay, a couple other measurements. I'm going over these real quick because they're not as important or useful to you. The net national income, this is how much people make with the GNP, the gross national product, minus depreciation. So this is going to be an estimate on how much people make. Your national income is income that's left over after taxes are removed for the net national income. So this is how much people bring home. Personal income, this is amount going to actual people before taxes. And disposable personal income is amount people have after paying taxes. Okay. Of these four, I think this one's the most useful. This is basically just saying how much people make on average after they pay the taxes. Okay. This shows us this percentage of growth. So you can see for the most part, we have lots of growth in the U.S. But again, that 2008-2009 recession, we saw a big negative decrease in personal income growth because people were losing their jobs, people were getting laid off, people weren't able to work because jobs were disappearing. So they lost a lot of wages during that time. Okay, so we're almost done here. The GDP is a very complicated thing to figure out, very complicated thing to factor. So there's entire agencies who just monitor this stuff. They do use a formula, and it involves all these sectors of the economy. So they have to look at the consumer sector, which is you and I, what we do, what we buy, what we sell. That's going to be the biggest part of the economy. Okay, and for this, they use households as the basic consumer unit, and then that's usually focused around families. Investments, business investments is another factor. So how many loans are being taken out for businesses? How many corporations are starting? Government spending, if the government is injecting money into the economy or if they're advocating systems like welfare or healthcare spending, and anything that involves the public sector. So local, state, national governments are all going to be a factor here. And then lastly, we have our imports and exports. So we take our exports, which is the X, and then we subtract our imports, which is the M, and this impacts our GDP as well. Okay. So this all being said is called the output expenditure model. The GDP is represented by this equation, and it's all those different things that I just talked about. Now, these things work in a cycle, okay? And I know this is kind of reaching for some of you because this is kind of difficult to grasp. If you want to watch this YouTube video, you can. But government spending, as the government spends money, this hopefully increases consumer spending and business investment, and then that's going to generate more taxes, okay? As businesses are started, this is going to create jobs, which is going to provide people with income. As people have income, they're going to invest that money into spending, which is going to provide for more income. They're also going to save some of that, which allows for investors and businesses to start up by borrowing that money from savings. Okay. Consumers are also going to be spending money, and that's going to create imports and exports as well. And then this can be a negative or a positive. In the U.S.'s case, we tend to import more than we export. So this usually drags down that number. Okay. So again, thank you for that. Let's go through these central questions real quick. The GDP is a perfect measurement for the economy because it provides a nice, easy, at-a-glance look if the economy is growing or declining. The GDP has to be measured and adjusted for inflation, because if it's not, then it could indicate growth where there is none. And then limitations for using the GDP: it doesn't always account for what's being built. It usually just accounts for how much is being built. Okay. So again, thank you guys for that. I wanted to make sure that you know how to contact me. So again, please email me if you need me. Please send me a message on Twitter. Whatever you need to do to get a hold of me is perfectly fine. I am going to be available a lot over this time, so I'm hoping to host a Google Meet session. If you guys need to talk to me one-on-one or in a small group, we'll be able to do that. I might even try some type of live streaming, so I'll update you guys on that as we go through that. So thank you so much. Again, I hope you're enjoying things. Please don't hesitate to reach out, and hopefully you have a great day.